This is the first opportunity I have had of addressing you since the Christmas Foundation meeting at the Goetheanum, and before beginning the lectures themselves, I want to speak of certain matters connected with the impulse which came into the anthroposophical movement through that Christmas meeting. We were glad on that occasion to welcome a number of members from England, above all Mr. Collison, a friend of many years, and the President here. And I should like now to renew the greeting I gave him in Dornach, then as the representative of the English Society. The deep significance of the impulse brought into the Anthroposophical Society through the Christmas Foundation meeting must be realized to the full, and many things that were said by way of characterization before that meeting will now have to be expressed in opposite terms. The Society had passed through difficult times, both outwardly and in an occult sense too, because in the post-war period a number of different enterprises were set on foot from within the Society itself, and this made it necessary that the Society should be imbued with a new impulse. So far as I myself am concerned, and I may be permitted to say it here, this was connected with something of very great significance. Some time before Christmas I was faced with a question, although the intention to give a new foundation to the Society had taken shape long before then. It became necessary for me to decide on taking the very step I had, for good reasons, refused to take at the time, when the Anthroposophical Society separated from the Theosophical Society. I had started then from the supposition that if I abstained from all administrative work and from the official leadership of the Society, merely occupying the position of a teacher, certain things connected with the inner life would present less difficulties than is the case when the teacher also holds an administrative office. But what was to be expected in the years 1912 and 1913 did not come about. Things have not worked out within the Anthroposophical Society as one assumed they would. And so I was obliged to give most earnest consideration to the question of whether I should or should not take over the presidency. I came to the conclusion that it was necessary to do so. But among our English friends, too, I want to emphasize something that was inevitably associated with the decision to assume the presidency of the Anthroposophical Society. Vis-à-vis the movement as a whole, such a step was hazardous, for it placed one before a very definite eventuality. The whole basis of the Anthroposophical movement is that revelations of the substance of spiritual knowledge flow down from the spiritual world. If one wishes to carry out the work of the Anthroposophical movement, it is not possible to devote oneself exclusively to human affairs and activities. One must be open to receive what may flow from the spiritual worlds. The laws of the spiritual world are definite and inviolable. They must be strictly obeyed. And it is difficult to combine the demands of an external office today, even though it be the presidency of the Anthroposophical Society, with the occult duties connected with the revelations coming from the spiritual world. And so one was obliged to face the question, will the spiritual powers who have showered their blessings upon the Anthroposophical Society hitherto continue to do so? You will certainly be able to realize what such an eventuality meant. The answer of the spiritual powers might well have been that this must not be, that there must be no assumption of any external official position. But today it can truly be said that before all the spiritual powers connected with the Anthroposophical movement, that the links between the spiritual worlds and the revelations which should flow through the Anthroposophical movement have become more intimate still, and the revelations have been vouchsafed in even greater abundance than before. So, of the two eventualities, the fortunate one for the progress of the movement has actually come about. It may now be said that ever since the new foundation of the Anthroposophical Society at the Goetheanum last Christmas, those spiritual powers from whom our revelations are received have showered upon us even greater grace than before. Therefore, in this respect too, a heavy care has been removed from the Society. Before the Christmas meeting, it was often necessary to emphasize the distinction between the Anthroposophical movement, which is the reflection on earth of a stream of spiritual life, and the Anthroposophical Society, which had an external form of administration, in that its functionaries were elected or formally appointed. Since Christmas, the opposite holds good. The Anthroposophical movement is now one with the Anthroposophical Society. The two are no longer to be distinguished from each other. For since I myself have become the president of the Society, the Anthroposophical movement has become identical with the Anthroposophical Society. This made it necessary in Dornach last Christmas to institute an executive council, which is not a council in the exoteric sense, but is to be regarded as an esoteric executive council, responsible for its actions to the spiritual powers alone, and which has not been elected but just formed. The whole procedure at Christmas differed from that usually adopted at foundation gatherings. This executive council may be called a council of initiative, seeing its tasks in what it actually carries out. Hence, the statutes adopted at the Christmas meeting are not worded in terms of ordinary statutes, but are a simple statement of the relationship that should exist between man and man, between the council and the members, between the individual members themselves, and so forth. The intentions of the council are set forth as a statement of what we intend and wish to do. They are statutes, in respect of form only. The whole procedure was quite different from that usually adopted by societies. The fact of salient importance is that an esoteric trend has now been brought into the Anthroposophical Society. The whole movement, flowing through the society as it now does, must have an esoteric character. This must be taken in all earnestness. Only those impulses for human action which come from the spiritual world will be determinative so far as the executive is concerned. It will not be a matter of giving effect to certain paragraphs or the like, but of promoting the true spiritual life unreservedly and with no other intent. Reference may here be made to a matter that may seem of secondary importance. New membership cards have been or are in course of being issued. As we now have about 12,000 members all over the world, the same number of membership cards have had to be prepared. All these cards will now bear my own signature. Many people considered that a stamp could be used for this purpose. But in the Anthroposophical movement, from now onward, everything must have a directly individual human character, and I must obey this, even in a detail like the above. Every membership card must lie before my eyes. I must read each name, and sign my own below it with my own hand. In this way a relationship is established with every individual member, slight though such a relationship may be to begin with. It is nevertheless real in the human sense. It would of course be much easier to let somebody else stamp the 12,000 membership cards, but this will not be done. This is a symbolic indication that in the future the human element prevailing in the society is all important. If the Executive Council at the Goetheanum is met with understanding from the members, you will see that as time goes on, every one of the intentions implicit in a Christmas meeting will be carried into effect, although things can only be done by degrees, and patience will be necessary. The council must be met with understanding, for it cannot take the fifth step before the second, or the second before the first, and if up to the present it has taken only half a step, the time will come when it is ready to take the fifth. If things are to be conducted in a really human way, one cannot live in the realm of abstraction. One must always enter into the concrete. And so, a new trend will become apparent in the anthroposophical movement. The movement will be esoteric in spirit. It will no longer seek for the esoteric in external things. Certain truths that it will be possible to communicate will be esoteric, for the reason that only those who participate in a living way in what goes on in the society will be capable of really working upon and assimilating them. But the lecture courses will no longer be withheld from the outside world as hitherto. They will not be sold through the trade, but they will be available for those who wish to obtain them. We shall, however, make a certain spiritual reservation by stating that we can recognize only such objections or criticisms as may come from those who are qualified by knowledge to pass judgment upon the contents of the lecture courses. Whatever people may choose to say in the future, in the domain of the occult, one's actions must be positive, not negative. All these things must be understood as time goes on. If the understanding is really there, the anthroposophical movement will take on an entirely new character. It will be realized that the Executive Council at the Goetheanum feels itself responsible only to the spiritual world, and every individual in the society will feel united with this executive. It may then be possible to achieve what must be achieved by the anthroposophical movement, if it is to fulfill the aim which in the course of these lectures I shall set before you from the depths of the spiritual life. And that is the end of the introduction. You are listening to Rudolf Steiner Audio.com. This is a reading of Karmic Relationships, Esoteric Studies by Rudolf Steiner. This is the reading of the last volume, volume 8 of these studies. And this is lecture 1 in that series, which is number 65 in the chronological series. For centuries now, men have become less and less accustomed to turn their minds to the spiritual world. We say, and rightly say, that the last few centuries have inaugurated an age of materialism, which has set its stamp not only upon man's thinking, but also upon his will, his actions, indeed, upon his whole life. And we in the Anthroposophical Society realize that the purpose of this society is to awaken forces whereby men will be released from their bondage to matter, from influences which make them deny the reality of the spiritual. But if the anthroposophical movement is to provide the impulse that is needed in the evolution of humanity, all the teachings, all the treasures of wisdom which have for many years been flowing through it must be applied with real earnestness. We must ponder deeply on the realities of man's life today. He comes into the world through birth with traits inherited from parents and ancestors. He is influenced and guided by current views and opinions, and at a certain age he becomes alert and awake to the life that surrounds him in the outer world. He pays attention to the ideas, the thoughts, the deeds, the impulses to be found in his environment. He tries to understand his place as a member of a particular nation, as a member of humanity in general, and so forth. In the anthroposophical movement, we accept the enlightening truth that all of us who are present here have passed through earlier lives on the earth. We have carried into this present life the fruits of those earlier lives. And we are mindful not only of what we are within our present nation, within modern humanity, but we realize that we have already passed through a number of incarnations on the earth, and that in other conditions of existence between death and rebirth, we have so worked at the development of the self, the ego, that we have made ourselves what we are today. But in his everyday consciousness, man does not realize that these previous earthly lives must also be taken into account. Nor will any progress be possible unless he studies the whole of life in the light of karma, of destiny taking shape from one earthly life to another. The historical life of humanity must above all be studied from this point of view. We say to ourselves that here or there an outstanding personality appeared, one who accomplished great things for mankind. Do we really understand such a personality if we merely consider that he was born at a certain time, and then follow the experiences and events of that single life? If the teachings available in the anthroposophical movement are taken seriously, our attitude must rather be this: there we see a personality, who in his incarnation now or in the past represents the fruits of earlier earthly lives, and we cannot really understand him without taking those earlier lives into account. If this point of view is seriously adopted, however, our conception of history will be radically different from that prevailing today. It is customary nowadays to recount the facts and events of the various epochs of human history, in connection, let us say, with a statesman, a painter, or some other outstanding figure. Accounts are given of his life and deeds on earth. But the idea that earlier earthly lives play over into a given incarnation is never seriously considered. Yet there can be no real understanding of history without the knowledge that what happens in a later time is the fruit carried over by the human being himself from earlier into later epochs. The human beings who are living today, or who lived centuries ago, were also on the earth in past ages, and have carried over into this later epoch the results of what they thought and experienced in those bygone times. How, for example, are we to understand the phenomenon of the present age as disturbing as the following? For well nigh 2,000 years, all that was inaugurated through the mystery of Golgotha has been with us. Ever since then, the Christ impulse has been working in European and Western civilization. But in the very same world through which the Christ impulse has passed, warming the hearts and enlightening the minds of men, a different element has taken root. In that same world are to be found the results of all that is inculcated, even into our children, through the introduction of modern science into the schools. All the ideas and views presented to us by the newspapers every morning at breakfast. Then again, think of the prevailing conceptions of the nature and being of man. Think of all that science has introduced into public life, all that art and other branches of culture have produced. It cannot be said that these things are permeated by the Christ impulse. They are there side by side with the Christ impulse. Indeed, many men are at pains to prevent the influence of the Christ impulse finding its way into the domains of anatomy, physiology, biology, or history, and to keep all such fields of knowledge separate and apart. Why is it so? As long as we merely speak of some personality who was, let us say, a scientist, who received this or that kind of education, who engaged in some form of research, or, again, if we merely speak of a statesman as having been a liberal or a conservative, we shall not understand how the Christ impulse can flow through modern civilization simultaneously with elements that need have nothing whatever in common with Christianity. How can this be? We shall, however, be able to understand if we study the different earthly lives of outstanding personalities. For we shall realize then that human beings carry over into later epochs the thoughts, the impulses of will they unfolded in their earlier incarnations. We observe personalities in history who have had great influence upon our own epoch. Think, for example, of one whose influence upon external life, especially in domains where science plays a part, has been deep and far-reaching. I am referring to Bacon, Lord Bacon of Verulam. He appears in the world, and details of his life are well known. We see him working in the sphere of Christian civilization. Yet there is no trace whatever of the Christian impulse in his writings. Bacon of Verulam might equally have arisen from some non-Christian civilization. What he actually says about Christianity is extremely superficial, compared with the real impulse that was within him. The same characteristic is to be perceived in Bacon the scientist, Bacon the philosopher, Bacon the statesman. Again, think of a personality like Darwin. Darwin was a good and sincere Christian, but there was no connection whatever between his Christianity and his ideas about the evolution of animals and man. The trend of thought in both cases is altogether different from that of the Christian impulse. We shall make no headway unless we ask ourselves, what can there have been in the earlier earthly lives, let us say of Bacon or of Darwin? What had they carried over from their earlier incarnations? If the Anthroposophical Society is to fulfill its purpose, such questions must no longer remain abstract. The mere knowledge that man lives many times on the earth, that one thing or another is carried over from an earlier into a later life, will not lead us far. There is, of course, nothing against reflections of this kind. They amount to no more than a general belief and are innocuous. But what we must do is to study the concrete realities of man's being and understand his life in some later epoch in the light of what he was in earlier incarnations. We shall now proceed to study these matters, beginning with an example taken from history, in order to tackle the subject of karma in all earnestness. Observing the progress of evolution revealed by civilization, by the deeds of humanity, we shall be able to perceive how individuals carry over into a later epoch what they acquired and made their own in an earlier one. For example, Bacon of Verulam appears in a certain age. Darwin appears in a later epoch. We discern a certain similarity between them. Superficial study merely sets out to discover how Bacon, how Darwin, evolved their particular views and ideas. But if we go more deeply into the matter, we find that both of them introduce into Christian civilization an element which, to begin with, is altogether inexplicable as a product of that civilization. As we look back, the question arises, had not Bacon and Darwin passed through earlier lives on earth? They carried over from those earlier incarnations the traits and characteristics revealed in their later lives. When we understand them as individuals, then and only then do we understand their real place in history. For when the reality of karma is taken seriously, history resolves itself into deeds of men, into streams of human lives flowing from remote ages of the past into the present and thence into the future. From now onward, these things will be spoken of without reserve. We shall speak of facts of the spiritual life in such a way that external history and the external world of nature will reveal themselves to us, will themselves reveal to us the spiritual realities lying behind. It is certain that these questions, bearing as they do upon the spiritual and physical worlds alike, will, to begin with, be taken less seriously than is their due, for judgments about such matters cannot be formed as judgments are formed about the things of ordinary life. And in order to indicate the many underlying factors which have to be taken into consideration, I should like to make a certain personal reference, although it is meant to be quite objective, before we come to answer the questions. Who was Bacon in his previous life? Who was Darwin in his previous life? Footnote: Dr. Steiner did not speak further of Darwin in these lectures. Readers are referred to his lecture in Dornoch, 16th of March, 1924, Karmic Relationships, Volume 1. End of footnote. In the title Goetheanum Weekly, as you know, I am writing the story of my life. but in a periodical intended for the outside world as well, it is not possible to speak of everything, and certain additions must be made for the sake of those within our movement who earnestly desire to find their way into the spiritual world. And so today, before I proceed in the next lectures to answer such questions as have here been raised, I should like to make this brief personal reference. Those who, like myself, were born in the 60s of last century have lived through the epoch when the Gabriel rulership of the preceding 3.5 centuries was superseded by the Michael rulership. The Michael rulership, that is to say, the entry of the sun impulse belonging to Michael into the civilization of humanity, began at the end of the 70s of last century. In the time immediately after the entry of the Michael influence in the 80s and 90s, when the Michael rulership was beginning to take effect behind the scenes of external happenings, those who were passing through the period of the development of the intellectual or mind-soul, that is to say, between the ages of 28 and 35, were really living in a kind of aloofness from the physical world. For when a human being is consciously active and alert in the mind-soul, he is aloof in a very real sense from the material world. We speak of man as a being composed of physical body, etheric body, sentient body. With his physical body, he stands clearly within the physical world. With his etheric body, and sentient soul too, he is strongly involved in the external world. But he can live aloof and apart from the external material world when he is fully conscious in the mind-soul, before the consciousness or spiritual soul awakens in the 35th year of life. Full consciousness within the mind-soul can transport a man altogether into the world of soul. And so in the 80s and 90s of last century, there was opportunity for those possessed of the corresponding faculties to live in the mind-soul, aloof to a greater or lesser extent from the physical world. What does this mean? It means that in the mind-soul, aloof from the material world, one was able to live in the very world into which Michael was entering on his way down toward the earth. The 80s and 90s produced many things that evoked wonder and admiration. There were many fields in which men became expert in many ways by which culture was enriched. Modern literature has words of high praise for this period. Think only of what was achieved by newspapers and in the world of art from the years 1879, 1880 to 1890 onward. But in these very years, there were happenings of an altogether different character. Behind a thin veil, a very thin veil at that time, was a world adjoining our physical world. Peculiar conditions prevailed shortly before the close of Kali Yuga at the end of the 19th century. In a neighboring world separated from the physical world by a veil so thin that it was impenetrable only to the everyday consciousness of men, things were taking place which must come to clearer and clearer evidence in the physical world, and their influences brought to effect. In very truth, something mysterious was at work in the closing decades of the 19th century. There were momentous happenings grouped around the spirit we name Michael. Participating in these happenings were strong and forceful followers of Michael, human souls living at that time in their existence between death and rebirth, not yet incarnate in the physical body. But there were also mighty demonic powers, who under the sway of Ahrimanic influences set themselves in rebellion against what was thus to come into the world. If I may now be allowed to make a personal reference, it is this. Conceptions of the reality of the spiritual world presented no difficulty to me at any age. What the spiritual world revealed penetrated into my soul, formed itself into ideas, into thoughts. On the other hand, things that came easily to others were difficult for me. I was always able quickly to grasp the arguments of natural scientific thinking, but concrete facts would not remain in my memory, simply would not register there. I could without effort understand the wave theory, the arguments of the mathematicians, physicists, and chemists. On the other hand, unlike most others, I could not recognize a particular mineral if I had seen it only once or twice. I was obliged to look at it perhaps 30 or 40 times before I could recognize it again. I found it difficult to retain concrete pictures of the things of the external material world. It was not easy for me to come fully into the physical world of sense. For this reason I lived with all the forces of the mind-soul, through what was taking place in this world, behind the veil, in this sphere of Michael's activity. And it was there that the great challenge arose once and for all to deal earnestly with the reality of the spiritual world, to bring these momentous questions to the light of day. External life offered no incentive, for all that was done there was to hash up once again the old, well-worn biographies of men like Darwin and Bacon. But there, behind the scenes, behind this thin veil, in the region where Michael was at work, the great questions were brought to an issue. And this above all was borne in upon one. What a vast difference there is between asking these questions inwardly and putting them into actual words. At the present time, people think that once something is known, it can immediately be spoken about. Indeed, everything that enters people's ken today is at once put into words and announced. But when the questions at issue in Michael's sphere in the 80s and 90s took hold of a man, they worked on into the 20th century. And even after having lived with these questions for decades, every time one wanted to utter them, it was as though the opponents of Michael gathered round and sealed one's lips, for about certain matters silence was to be maintained. Much that remained a Michael secret had therefore to be carried onward in the heart of the anthroposophical movement itself. Above all, the truths relating to historical connections of the kind to which reference has been made. But for a certain time now, actually for months, it has been possible for me to speak of these things without reserve. That is why I have been able to speak freely of the connections between earthly lives, and shall also do so here. For this is part of the unveiling of these Michael mysteries, which took the course I have described to you. This is one of the subjects which, up till now, has been dealt with in a more abstract way. At the beginning of the lecture, I spoke of an eventuality, namely, that the spiritual world might have withheld consent. It has not been so. What has actually happened is that since the Christmas Foundation meeting, and above all because of the opportunities vouchsafed to me for occult work, the demons who hitherto prevented these things from being voiced have been compelled to remain silent. The things to which I refer are not, of course, entirely new, for they were experienced a long time ago in the way I have indicated to you. But it must be remembered that in occultism, things that are discovered one day cannot be communicated the next. I have now spoken of a certain change in circumstances, and am telling you these things in order that when, in the future, reference is made to concrete realities in the repeated earthly lives of conspicuous or inconspicuous personalities, you may understand them with the necessary earnestness. Such things must not be lightly taken, but with the respect that is their due. In the forthcoming lectures, such indications will be multiplied and elaborated. But before speaking about earlier incarnations of men like Darwin and others, I wanted first to emphasize by what kind of spiritual atmosphere these things must be pervaded, and the nature of the enlightenment that needs to be shed upon them.